All right, get ready because today we are really diving deep into virtual reality in nursing education.
Oh, exciting.
Yeah, and it looks like you've sent us a really interesting collection of articles on this,
Hmm.
and we're going to really kind of dissect this. You seem particularly interested in how VR is, changing things up, especially when we're talking about, getting nurses ready for those really high-pressure situations.
Yeah, it's a really hot topic right now in nursing education. I think there's a huge potential there for VR to really change how we educate nurses, and the research is showing that it's not just hype.
Yeah, it's not just a fad at this point, right?
Right. We're seeing real results. So
Yeah.
let's get into the nitty-gritty here. Um, One of the things that really stood out to me, I was looking at the range of procedures that are covered in these studies. I mean, we're talking sepsis management,
Wow.
neonatal resuscitation,
Yeah.
IV injections, placing NG tubes, even something I had to look up, focused assessment with sonography for trauma, fast.
Yes, yes, and that's a great example of why this is so relevant. FAST is a rapid ultrasound that's used in trauma to very quickly find internal bleeding.
Yeah.
And, because of VR, nurses can practice these critical skills in a really safe environment. There's no risk to a patient, but the
Mhm.
experience can feel very, very real.
I bet. And so much of nursing is about confidence, right?
Right. It's about clear thinking under pressure. And one of the studies that really jumped out at me, it looked at this immersive VR sepsis game. And I was really fascinated by how researchers actually measured the students' anxiety levels and their self-confidence before and after using the game.
And the results are huge.
Yeah.
What they found was a 26.1% increase in self-confidence, which, I mean, wow, that's amazing, and a 23.4% decrease in anxiety.
Right.
So when you think about nurses, going into these really high-stakes situations, if we can give them even a little bit more confidence, that's huge.
It's like a superpower almost.
It is. And, it makes you think, what kind of impact could that have on patient outcomes, If we can give nurses that edge, what could that mean for patients?
Absolutely. And I mean, it makes you think, we talk about nursing shortages and things like that. If we can better equip our nurses, kind of give them the tools that they need to feel more confident, that could have a ripple effect, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
One of the things, and this is kind of anecdotal, but they quoted one of the students who said that they were so engrossed in this VR sepsis simulation that they were genuinely worried that their virtual patient was going to go into cardiac arrest.
Wow, that's incredible.
Which, I mean, talking about real. These simulations are so real that it's eliciting that kind of visceral response.
Right, and that feeling of being there in that virtual world, that's called presence.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really important, that feeling of presence for learning. When you're immersed like that, you're not just going through the motions, you're emotionally engaged. And that really helps with learning. It mirrors what it's like in actual practice.
So it's more than just reading a textbook.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
It's one thing to read about how to do something. It's another thing to actually do it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is as close as you can get to actually doing it without the risk.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
So, I mean, it's, we talked about, high pressure situations. There's another study that really kind of stood out was one that looked at VR training for focused lung ultrasound, or FLUS.
Right.
I'm curious, do you think VR could really change the game when it comes to learning these hands-on skills?
Yes.
Because that's traditionally been the realm of, you got to be there, you got to have your hands on a patient or on a dummy or something like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And what the researchers found is that VR training for this particular skill was just as effective as using the traditional screen-based simulator.
Wow.
Which is amazing because you're right, ultrasound is so hands-on. So the fact that VR can be just as effective is really incredible.
But we're not just talking about replacing lectures with fancy tech here. We're talking about, actually, this could change how we teach these very practical skills.
Absolutely. And the great thing about VR is that it gives nurses a safe space to practice even these high-risk procedures without, putting a patient at risk. Imagine, I mean, the possibilities are endless. They could practice complex surgeries or managing, rare emergencies. It's really exciting to think about.
Yeah, it really is. So it's like having that flight simulator, but for nurses, which I think is a really great analogy. Speaking of simulations, one of the studies really looked at VR being used to train for something as routine but critical as intravenous injections or IVs.
Right. Every nurse has to do those.
Right, exactly. And what was really intriguing to me about this study was they used something called reflection logs after each VR session.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I thought it was really, really interesting. Those reflection logs ended up being really valuable for the instructors because it gave them a window into how the students were thinking and where they were struggling. And one thing that kept coming up was that students really had a hard time finding the vein accurately on the first try, which, let's be honest, happens in real life too.
Yeah, it does. Even experienced nurses, sometimes you can't find that vein.
Exactly. But in the VR world, it's okay. You can make those mistakes. You can learn from them. No one gets hurt.
Right. There's no risk. And it's interesting because it provides that insight, like you said, to the instructors.
Yeah.
So then they can tailor their feedback
Mm-hmm.
based on those specific challenges. Right. They can see, okay, this student is really struggling with this one aspect. Let's really focus on that.
Exactly. So VR isn't just this training tool, it also becomes an assessment tool.
That's really cool.
Right. They can really see how the student is doing, where they need help, and really personalize the learning experience in a way that we just can't do with traditional methods.
It's like having a window into the student's thought process, right?
Yeah.
You can see where they hesitate. You can see where they get confused, how they react under pressure.
Exactly, exactly. And that level of insight is it's invaluable for helping us to train these competent and confident nurses. But it's not just about the technical skills, right?
Right.
One thing that I found really interesting was how VR is being used to cultivate empathy.
Yeah, that was a big one for me too. There was one study in particular that used 360-degree videos and interactive scenarios to really simulate what it's like to live with dementia.
Right.
And I thought that was just such a powerful application because, it's one thing to read about a condition. It's another thing to try to imagine it.
Mm.
But to actually experience it, albeit virtually, it just has to be so impactful.
Absolutely. And what researchers found is that the students who went through that VR dementia simulation, they had such a deeper understanding of what patients go through. They weren't just learning about it from a textbook. They were experiencing it. And I think that's just so powerful.
Right, and it builds empathy, which is something, we talk about that a lot in nursing.
Right.
But how do you teach that, right?
Right.
This seems like a really, really powerful way to do that.
It really does. It helps to bridge that gap between what they're learning in the classroom and then what they're actually going to see when they get out there in the real world. And that's really what it's all about, right?
Absolutely. And I have to wonder, as these simulations become more and more realistic, are there any ethical considerations that we need to be thinking about here?
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about things like dementia, sensitive topics.
Absolutely. I think that's a really, really important conversation to be having, especially as this technology continues to evolve. We have to make sure that we're using it responsibly and ethically,
Absolutely.
especially when we're dealing with vulnerable populations. But at the same time, the fact that we can use VR to really humanize healthcare education, I think that's really exciting.
It is exciting. It really is. So I have to ask, because this is on a lot of people's minds, is VR accessible to all nursing schools?
Mm.
I mean, cost is always a factor when you're talking about bringing in new technologies.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's true. The headsets themselves can be pricey, but the good news is that the technology is really advancing quickly. And as it does, the costs are coming down. Plus, researchers are already starting to explore using mobile phone-based VR systems.
Oh, wow.
So you could imagine, using your phone to immerse yourself in a virtual hospital ward. That's amazing.
That makes it so much more accessible. Wow.
It does. It really opens up a world of possibilities, especially for nursing schools that might not have the budget for those really expensive systems.
That's incredible. So, I mean, we're talking about potentially leveling the playing field here. That's really, really neat.
Yeah.
I am just blown away. We've talked about how VR can boost confidence. It can improve these technical skills. We even talked about how it can cultivate empathy. It just seems like there's so much potential here.
There is. We've really just scratched the surface of what VR can do.
And on that note, I think we need to take a quick break. But when we come back, we're going to delve even deeper into this.
All right, and we are back. We are going to keep going deeper into this VR in nursing education. Before the break, we were talking about accessibility, right? And how, these phone-based systems could really be a game changer. It makes you think, what other innovations are kind of out there? What's on the horizon? What's next?
Yeah, and there's some really cool things being developed right now. One study looked at the use of mixed reality in nursing education.
Ooh, mixed reality. See, now you're throwing jargon at me now. I gotta stop you. I gotta break it down. What is mixed reality? Okay, so imagine you're wearing this headset and you're immersed in this virtual environment. But then on top of that, you have digital elements that are overlaid onto your actual surroundings.
So it's not fully immersive. Like you can still see the real world.
Exactly, exactly. So it's like having like X-ray vision, but for nurses.
Okay, now that's pretty cool. Now, how does that actually work in like a learning setting?
So in this study, nursing students used these mixed reality headsets while they were training, and they found that the students were much more engaged in the learning, and it even helped them to develop their clinical judgment.
Wow. So instead of just reading about like a procedure in a textbook, they can actually visualize it like three-dimensionally, almost like they're in the room with the patient.
Right. And because you're blending the virtual and the real world, students can practice their hands-on skills in a way that feels really intuitive, really realistic.
That's amazing. So they can actually see their own hands interacting with like virtual objects, which I imagine would really help to kind of bridge that gap between like the book learning and the actually doing it.
Exactly, exactly. And that feeling of realism, it's so important for building their confidence and making sure that they're competent, especially when they're put in those high pressure situations that, nurses face all the time.
Yeah, speaking of those high pressure situations, I was really fascinated by the studies that looked at how VR is being used to train for like emergency situations.
Hmm.
There was one in particular that I remember that focused on neonatal resuscitation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, talk about high stakes, right?
Absolutely. Every second counts in those situations.
And you have to be ready, right? You have to be ready to think on your feet and take action. And so this study used this VR gamification to teach these neonatal resuscitation skills, which I thought was really fascinating.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, they're basically taking a life-saving medical procedure and they're turning it into a game.
Well, not exactly turning it into a game. It's more about like they're taking elements of game design. So like think about challenges, rewards, feedback, and they're incorporating that into the learning.
Oh, okay. So it's about making it fun, making it engaging.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's especially helpful for students who, maybe they learn better when they're really engaged in something.
Right, right. So it's like you're kind of sneaking the learning in there while they're having fun.
Exactly.
But did it actually work?
Yeah. The group that used this VR game, they were so much better at their knowledge, their problem solving, even their self-confidence was higher compared to, the students who just, sat through a lecture, or even the ones who trained on those more traditional simulators.
Wow, so they were actually able to measure a difference. That's incredible.
They did. And the students who did the VR gamification stuff, they actually did better than the group that trained on the regular simulators, especially when it came to problem solving and their self-confidence.
That is a game changer, like literally. So, I mean, this could be huge, not just for emergency situations, but really for any skill that you're trying to teach nurses, right?
Yeah. Right. And you can change it based on like how people learn best, right?
Right. So it's a very personalized approach,
Exactly. Exactly.
which again, better outcomes, right? That's what we're always striving for.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious, like, how does this VR training actually stack up against traditional methods when we're talking about like actual skill development? And I know we keep coming back to this, but one of the studies looked at VR training for that FAST exam, the focused assessment with sonography for trauma.
Yeah, yeah. And this study, they compared it to, what's traditionally been done, which is using those screen-based simulators.
Yeah.
And the results were really
What
interesting.
do they find?
The students who were trained using VR were just as good at doing those fast exams as the students who did the traditional simulator training, but they spent way less time training.
Really? So not only is it like as effective, it's more efficient.
Exactly.
That's amazing. What is it about VR that makes it such a good learning tool?
Well, you're immersed, right? You're really engaged in what you're doing. And, it's a safe space to practice.
So you're basically tricking your brain into learning better. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, pretty much. Your brain thinks it's real, so you're more likely to remember the information. And you can make mistakes. You can do it over and over again until you get it right. There's no real-world consequences in the VR world.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And that probably really takes the pressure off too for these students.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So we've been talking a lot about technical skills. But what about those like softer skills that nurses need? Like empathy, communication, all of that. Can VR help with that too?
Yeah, absolutely. And more research is coming out that shows it can. One study looked at using immersive VR to help nursing students develop empathy for patients with Alzheimer's.
Oh, yeah, I think I remember reading about this one. And didn't they used some kind of virtual dementia tour,
Hmm.
right, to simulate what it's like to actually live with those cognitive impairments.
Right, exactly.
That's powerful stuff.
It is. And
Yeah.
and what they found is the students that went through that, they were much more likely to understand the challenges that their patients were facing. They could empathize with them. They weren't just reading it in a textbook anymore, they were experiencing it.
And that's huge because, like I said, it's one thing to read about it, it's another thing to imagine it. But to actually experience it, even if it's virtually, I mean, that has to change how you approach these patients.
Absolutely, absolutely. It helps them to connect what they're learning with what's actually happening in the patient's life.
It's VR becomes this, like, portal for empathy.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
But it's not just about empathy for patients, right?
Yeah.
I mean, nurses also need to be, culturally sensitive. They need to be good communicators.
Mhm.
Um, do we see VR being used for any of that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important now more than ever that our nurses know how to communicate effectively with patients from all different backgrounds, right?
Absolutely.
And VR can help with that too.
Also.
So some researchers have created these VR simulations where nursing students have to interact with patients from different cultures, different backgrounds. And these simulations, they give the students all these different situations, right? And the students have to choose how they're going to respond, how they're going to talk to the patient. And then they get feedback on whether or not they were being culturally sensitive.
So it's a safe space to kind of practice those interactions.
Exactly.
Because sometimes those conversations can be a little delicate.
They can, but in the VR world, it's okay. You make a mistake, you learn from it, no harm done.
That's great. So it's like building that confidence, but in a communication sense.
Exactly. And it's not just about patients either. They can use this to simulate working with colleagues from different backgrounds.
Oh, that's interesting. So really building a more cohesive team. I
Exactly.
mean, the possibilities really do seem endless here.
They really do. As technology keeps getting better, we're going to see more and more applications for this.
This has been incredible. We've gone from like those basic nursing procedures all the way to these really high pressure situations and then, you know, building empathy, communication. VR really can touch every aspect of nursing education.
It really can. And like I said, I think we're just getting started.
So as we kind of move into this last part of our deep dive here, I have to ask, for those nurses who are already out there, right, they've already gone through school, they're building their careers, is there a place for VR in their professional development?
Yeah.
So we've talked about how VR can be like this amazing tool for nursing students. But what about, the nurses who are already out there, who are already working in the field? Can VR be a part of their like professional development too?
Definitely. Yeah, VR isn't just for students. It's really valuable for like experienced nurses too. They can use it to keep their skills sharp or learn new things.
That makes sense because like healthcare is always changing, right?
Yeah.
There are always new procedures, new technologies. So how can VR help these, more experienced nurses kind of stay like up to date?
Well, they can use it to like refresh their skills or learn those procedures that maybe they don't do very often. Things they might not see every day.
It's like having um, like a flight simulator, but for nurses.
Exactly.
Instead of like takeoffs and landings, they're practicing, I don't know, like what to do during a cardiac event or managing like really complicated medication, something like that.
Exactly. And one thing I think is really cool is that VR can help bridge that gap between like the theory and the actual doing. Like a nurse might go to a conference, learn about a new technique, but then like actually doing it on a patient, that can be scary.
Right. There's a lot of pressure there.
Exactly. But with VR, they can practice in this like safe environment. They can make mistakes and it's fine. No one gets hurt.
Right. There are no real life consequences if you like mess up in the VR world.
Exactly.
That's a great point.
And then when they're confident, they can use what they learned in the real world.
And it's not just like individual skills, right? I mean, you could use this for like team training.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you could have nurses from different departments, like the ER, the ICU.
Right.
And they could all work together in like a virtual trauma situation.
Oh, wow. That would be intense.
Yeah, and it would help them learn how to communicate better, how to work together seamlessly during an emergency.
That's incredible. So we've covered so much ground here. We talked about, basic nursing skills, high pressure situations, building empathy, communication. I mean, it seems like VR can really like touch every part of nursing education and even like beyond, right, into their actual careers.
I know, it's pretty amazing, right? And I really think this is just the beginning. There's so much more to come.
It's really exciting to think about the possibilities. So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive here today, what's like the one big takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with?
I hope they realize that VR isn't just like a gimmick or something. It's a powerful tool, and it really has the potential to change healthcare for the better.
I completely agree. And, it's been so interesting talking to you today and kind of getting your insights on all of this.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. I've had a great time.
And to all our listeners out there, thank you so much for joining us on this incredible deep dive into the world of VR in nursing education. We hope you learned something new and interesting today. And who knows, maybe this will even inspire you to explore the world of VR yourself. And until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.